Hi, I'm Renee.
And I'm Eric.
Today, we're going to talk about school discipline and research associated with threat assessment. Threat assessment is a violence prevention strategy, not a discipline program. Threat assessment does not replace your existing disciplinary system, but the information gained in a threat assessment may lead you to make different disciplinary decisions.
Threat assessment and discipline are distinct processes. A threat assessment focuses on the meaning of a student's behavior and whether it's a warning of impending or future violence. Most threats to harm someone are not serious. They're often expressions of emotion, or maybe efforts to cause a disruption or intimidate someone, and the person doesn't actually intend to carry out the threat.
Unlike threat assessment, discipline is concerned with what a student has already done, whether the student disobeyed a rule, the impact that the student's behavior had on others, and what the consequences should be. A threat might not be serious from a threat assessment perspective, but very serious from a disciplinary perspective.
We're going to show you a series of case situations. For each case, we can only present a limited amount of information, and in a real case, you would gather more information before you made a decision. However, for teaching purposes, we're going to ask you to make some decisions based on the information provided here, assuming there is no additional information that would contradict what has been presented. In other words, these cases are designed to make a teaching point and do not illustrate the full range of information you would want to gather in a real case.
Here are your essays. Some of you didn't do as well as I had hoped, but if you want a higher grade, you can rewrite it and turn it in to me tomorrow.
I'm not doing this again. It's stupid.
Does this interaction suggest the student poses a threat?
This boy's behavior clearly merits disciplinary action. He was aggressive, disrespectful, and disruptive. The teacher cannot allow this kind of behavior in her classroom. That is the disciplinary side of this situation. But we also need to look at this case from a threat assessment perspective. Here all we know is that the boy is expressing anger in an inappropriate manner. The behavior itself does not show that he poses a threat that requires the team to take protective action.
However, the threat assessment team should assess his mental state and his intentions towards the teacher. In many cases like this, a student will calm down and admit that he was frustrated and acted inappropriately. He may apologize to the teacher for his behavior. In these cases, the threat can be resolved as not serious.
But if the boy continued to express anger or hostility toward the teacher, or if there were other threats the boy had made regarding this teacher, the threat might be more serious. Let's look at another situation.
I hate this school. Let's call in a bomb threat so we can get out early.
Yeah, make sure you dial star 67 so they can't track your call.
If you want people to live, leave the school. There's a bomb in the building.
In this situation, does the girl pose a serious threat of violence?
This is another case where there's a big difference between the disciplinary side of the case and the threat assessment side of the case. From a disciplinary perspective, the student has broken the law and is in serious trouble. She could be arrested and charged with a crime. She could receive a serious disciplinary consequence from the school.
However, from a threat assessment perspective, there is no bomb and no indication that the student poses a threat to others. School discipline and threat assessment are separate processes, and a serious disciplinary violation is not necessarily a serious threat. Let's look at one more situation.
You should talk to somebody. It isn't right the way that they're treating you.
I told them I got them on my hit list. Told them their time was coming. Let them think about that for a while.
This is a situation that many schools have experienced. How serious is this threat?
In many schools, a student is claimed to have a hit list of people he or she plans to kill. These lists are usually invented for the purpose of expressing anger and creating a sensation. A hit list can be disrupting and frightening, but by itself is not a serious threat. The threat assessment team would want to find out why the student has created a hit list, since there is likely a peer conflict or some other problem that merits attention.
The threat assessment team would want to investigate the report of a hit list, because it's possible that the student not only has a hit list, but has acquired weapons and made plans to carry out an attack. Threat assessment takes a problem-solving approach to student misbehavior. A threat often indicates that a student is frustrated with the problem he or she cannot solve, and the team looks for ways to help the student learn more acceptable ways to deal with conflict.
A threat assessment considers the seriousness of the student's behavior. It considers the student's intentions and the circumstances of the behavior. An accidental violation of rules is not the same as an intentional violation, and a minor violation is treated differently than a major violation. Threat assessment represents a different approach to school safety and student misbehavior than zero tolerance. Zero tolerance policies are intended to deter violence and substance use by sending a strong message of strict discipline for even minor violations. Research has found no evidence that zero tolerance makes schools safer or improves student behavior. On the contrary, zero tolerance practices have contributed to a large increase in school suspensions. Under a zero tolerance approach, punishment is automatic for all cases, and suspension or expulsion are routine outcomes. But under a threat assessment approach, the punishment varies according to the circumstances, the student's intentions, and the severity of the behavior. In most cases, the student is not suspended or expelled. The differences between zero tolerance and threat assessment are clearest in the cases of toy guns, such as water guns and bubble guns, and other objects that do not pose a serious threat of violence.
There are reasons to be cautious about using out-of-school suspension. A large body of educational research has found that suspension does not have its desired effects on most students, and schools that make a greater use of suspension have lower achievement levels. Some of the common negative consequences of suspension are students tend to fall behind in their coursework and are at increased risk of failing. Students feel alienated and unwanted at school, and students who are suspended are more likely to misbehave and get suspended again, rather than improve their behavior. Research also indicates that schools that use suspension as a frequent disciplinary consequence have higher dropout rates than schools that use suspension less often. These findings are not simply because students in some schools misbehave more often. These studies compared schools with similar student demographics to isolate the effects of suspension on dropout rates.
Research in Virginia high schools found the same problem. Schools that use suspension frequently have higher dropout rates than schools that use suspension less often. These findings were true for both black and white students, high and low poverty schools, and urban and rural schools. The high suspension rates were not simply because students in some schools were more aggressive or rejected school rules.
In 2014, the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Justice issued a Dear Colleague letter to educators about the large racial disparities in school discipline. There is concern that racial disparities are not explained by differences in student behavior and instead reflect racial discrimination. Black students are suspended at approximately twice the rate of Hispanic and white students. Visit the U.S. Department of Education's website for resources and advice on improving school discipline.
We cannot simply stop using school suspension without having effective alternatives. Many schools now use an approach called Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. Schools using PBIS emphasize teaching and rewarding appropriate behavior. There is great emphasis on defining clear, tangible expectations for students and consistent rule enforcement. PBIS uses a multi-tiered approach to prevention. They conduct functional behavioral assessments and develop positive behavioral intervention plans for students who repeatedly engage in inappropriate behavior. Randomized controlled trials have shown that schools using PBIS have lower suspension rates and fewer office referrals than control schools.
new and popular approach to discipline that can be used in conjunction with PBIS is restorative justice. Restorative justice places emphasis on teaching students to appreciate the impact of their actions on others and to take responsibility for any harm they cause. Classes hold regular meetings or circles to build a sense of community and shared commitment to treating one another with respect. A student who misbehaves is guided to take responsibility for the harm caused by his or her behavior, understand how it affects others, and take action to repair the harm. Suspensions are discouraged because harm cannot be repaired if the student is not there to participate in the process. A longitudinal study in Denver public schools demonstrated significant reductions in the gap between black and white suspension rates in schools using restorative justice practices.
Now let's talk about research on threat assessment. There is more than 15 years of research on threat assessment involving hundreds of Virginia schools as well as schools in other states. Most of the research was conducted with schools using the University of Virginia's model, the Virginia Student Threat Assessment Guidelines. Controlled studies using several hundred schools have found that threat assessment is a safe and effective practice. Schools using the Virginia guidelines have lower suspension rates, less bullying, and a more positive school climate than schools using other models of threat assessment or no form of threat assessment. A randomized controlled trial found that the University of Virginia's threat assessment program resulted in increased counseling for students, more parental involvement, fewer suspensions, and fewer school transfers for students who made threats of violence.
Virginia schools were surveyed about their threat assessment cases in the 2014 to 2015 school year. Schools were free to use any model of threat assessment that met the basic requirements of the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. Here's a summary of findings from a sample of 1,865 cases reported by 785 schools. Threat cases occurred at all grade levels, but primarily in the middle grades. Students made different types of threats. The most common specified threats were to kill or to use a weapon. Students most often threatened other students.
Following a threat assessment and appropriate interventions by team members, almost all threats were not carried out. In a small percentage of cases, a student attempted to carry out a threat, but it was averted or stopped. For example, a student who had made a threat was apprehended with a weapon before it could be used. In less than 1% of cases, the threat was carried out. All of these cases involved some kind of physical assault, such as a fight, but none of them resulted in a serious injury.
There was a wide range of disciplinary outcomes for threats. The most frequent outcome was out-of-school suspension, but this occurred in about half of the cases. The most serious consequences were rare, with only 2% being expelled and fewer than 2% being arrested or placed in juvenile detention. The vast majority of students were able to return to their original school with no change in placement. About 10% were transferred to an alternative school, and a few transferred to a different regular school or moved out of the school district. About 5% were placed on homebound instruction.
There were no statistically significant racial differences in disciplinary outcomes. White, black, and Hispanic students were equally likely to be suspended, removed from their school, or expelled. There were no racial differences in other disciplinary outcomes that were examined either.
In summary, research in Virginia schools shows that threat assessment teams respond to a wide range of threats at all grade levels. Almost all threats are resolved without being carried out. There's a wide range of disciplinary consequences for threats, but the majority are resolved without severe consequences. Almost all students are able to return to their school, although about 20% end up receiving educational services in a different school or at home. Most noteworthy is that there are no differences between Black, Hispanic, and white students in disciplinary outcomes.